U.S. Senator, Confederate Attorney General, Secretary of War, and Secretary of State. Born a British subject in the British West Indies on August 6, 1811, Benjamin was taken to the United States in his early youth. The child of Sephardic Jewish settlers, he was descended from families that could be traced back to 15th-century Spain. Judah Benjamin's boyhood was much more steeped in Jewish culture and tradition than either Southern or Jewish historians have acknowledged. He was reared in Charleston, South Carolina, and grew to manhood in New Orleans, two of the largest Jewish communities in the United States in the early 19th century. His father was one of the 12 dissenters in Charleston who formed the first Reform Congregation of America. Although the records of the congregation were burned and we cannot know for certain, he probably was one of the first boys confirmed at the new Reformed Temple, which was founded when he was 13 years old. The character of a Jewish boy reared by a deeply involved Jewish family would be shaped by that experience the rest of his life. He went to Yale Law School at 14, left under mysterious circumstances, and was admitted to the Louisiana bar in 1832. A strategic marriage to Natalie S. Martin, whose family belonged to the ruling Creole aristocracy in New Orleans, propelled him into financial success and subsequently into a political career. He participated in the explosive growth of New Orleans between 1820 and 1840 as a commercial lawyer and political advocate for banking, finance, and railroad interest. Benjamin prospered for a time as a sugar planter, helped to organize the Illinois Central Railroad, and was elected to the Louisiana legislature in 1842. As a rising political star in the Whig Party, he was the first acknowledged Jew to be elected to the U.S. Senate 1852, re-elected as a Democrat 1858. In the Senate, he was noted as an eloquent defender of Southern interest and has been ranked by some historians as one of the 5 great orators in Senate history, the equal of Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun. In Washington, he met Jefferson Davis, 1853, and forged a friendship in an unusual confrontation. They were both intense and ambitious senators, Davis of Mississippi and Benjamin of Louisiana. Verna Howell Davis, the future First Lady of the Confederacy, wrote years later of them during this period, "Sometimes when they did not agree on a measure, hot words in glacial, polite phrases passed between them. Because of a suspected insult on the floor of the Senate, Benjamin challenged Davis to a duel. Davis quickly and publicly apologized, and the incident of honor defended and satisfied drew them together in a relationship of mutual respect. His wife had taken his only daughter, Nanette, and moved to Paris in 1842. She joined him briefly after his election to the Senate, but returned again to Paris because of scandalous rumors about her in Washington. Thereafter, Benjamin saw her once a year on trips to Paris. Only a fragment of a letter remains between them. "Speak nor to me of economy," she wrote. "It is so fatiguing." In the Senate, Benjamin was embroiled in the political turmoil leading to the Civil War, and he was frequently attacked on the basis of his religious background. Once in a debate on slavery, when Senator Ben Wade of Ohio accused Benjamin of being an Israelite with Egyptian principles, Benjamin is reported to have replied, "It is true that I am a Jew, and when my ancestors were receiving their 10 Commandments from the immediate deity amidst the thunderings and lightnings of Mount Sinai, the ancestors of my opponent were herding swine in the forest of Great Britain." It was a rare reply. Usually, when newspapers, political enemies, and military leaders insulted him with stinging phrases of religious prejudice, he almost never answered, but simply retained what observers called a perpetual smile. After secession, President Jefferson Davis appointed Benjamin as his Attorney General on February 21, 1861. The President chose him because, in Davis's own words, Benjamin had a very high reputation as a lawyer, and my acquaintance with him in the Senate had impressed me with the lucidity of his intellect, his systematic habits, and capacity for labor. Since the office of Attorney General was a civilian post, the leadership in the capital considered it of little consequence, but this did not deter Benjamin. He plunged into the cabinet policy debates on all aspects of the Confederacy and developed a reputation as one who loved details, complexity, and problem-solving. He became the administrator to the President, called by observers the Pubali of the Confederate government. At his first cabinet meeting, Secretary of War Leroy P. Walker said, "There was only one man there who had any sense, and that man was Benjamin." During his tenure at the Justice Department, Benjamin became a strong advocate of cotton diplomacy, the policy of shipping cotton to Europe as barter for arms and supplies, and of denying cotton to countries that did not support the South. Davis then appointed Benjamin acting Secretary of War in September, making the appointment permanent on November 21st. By appointing a brilliant administrator without military experience, Davis could thereby be his own Secretary of War, a position he had held in the Franklin Pierce administration. But Benjamin was a failure because when the war went badly on the battlefield, the military turned on him as a scapegoat. Frustrated generals who could not attack the president publicly had a convenient target in his Secretary of War. As the Union forces struck back, criticism of Benjamin mounted. He was not a military man, and his orders, though flowing from constant meetings with the President, were treated as originating from him and were resented in the field as interference and amateurism. Benjamin had highly publicized quarrels with General Beauregard and General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson. Beauregard called Benjamin in a letter to Davis that functionary at his desk who deems it a fit time to write lectures on law while the enemy is mustering at our front. Jackson threatened to resign, writing Davis that, with such interference in my command, I cannot be expected to be of much service in the field. Davis defended his right hand, as Varna described Benjamin, who was working 12 and 14 hours a day with Davis and was being blamed by the military for carrying out the President's orders. Benjamin was berated by Northern generals as well. When Benjamin Butler, who commanded the forces that conquered New Orleans, issued a statement about the city, he said, "The most effective supporters of the Confederacy have been mostly Jews, who all deserve at the hands of the government what is due the Jew Benjamin." The anger against Benjamin came to a head after the fall of Roanoke Island in early February 1862. Benjamin had been under intense pressure from General Henry A. Wise at Roanoke and Governor Henry T. Clark of North Carolina to send many more men and arms to the garrison there. He had resisted for reasons that would not be known until 25 years after the war, and he accepted the subsequent public condemnation in silence to protect his country. Roanoke was sacrificed because to have done otherwise would have revealed to the enemy just how desperate the South was. At the dedication of the Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond in 1890, Colonel Charles Marshall, an aide-de-camp of General Lee's staff, read part of a letter from Benjamin which revealed that President Davis had agreed to allow Benjamin to be publicly censored. I consulted the President whether it was best for the country that I should submit to unmerited censure or reveal to a congressional committee our poverty and my utter inability to supply the requisitions of General Wise, and thus run the risk that the fact should become known to some of the spies of the enemy, of whose activity we were well assured. It was thought best for the public service that I should suffer the blame in silence, and a report of censure on me was accordingly made by the Committee of Congress. When Benjamin resigned, Davis, as a reward for the loyalty, promptly named him Secretary of State. On the subject of slavery, both Davis and Benjamin were enlightened Southerners whose attitudes were evolving. Most Jewish historians have understandably reacted with revulsion to the fact that Benjamin owned 140 slaves on a sugar plantation, and they have been unable to consider the question of his views on slavery with anything but embarrassed dismay. To comprehend Benjamin on this score, one must put him into context as a political figure against a backdrop of planter dogmatism and abolitionist fervor. Such an explanation leads directly to an extraordinary episode of the war in which Benjamin played a central role: the effort to persuade Davis to issue a Confederate Emancipation Proclamation which would promote slaves' freedom in exchange for military service. That move, which began to take shape early in the war in the minds of military and political leaders, but did not surface until 1864, is usually dismissed as a desperate gamble made at the end of the war to lure Britain into the fight. But as Secretary of State, Benjamin's obsession all along had been to draw England into the war. Slavery, however, was a stumbling block because England had abolished slavery in 1833. As the clouds of defeat gathered, Benjamin spoke before 10,000 people in Richmond, delivering a remarkable speech in favor of a Confederate offer to free slaves who would fight for the South. Although the idea of arming slaves as soldiers was supported by Lee, who needed more men in the field, the public and political reaction was fierce. Hal Cobb, the former governor of Georgia, wrote that if slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong. Nevertheless, the Confederate Congress passed a partial version of the measure on March 13th, but by then it was too late. Richmond fell less than a month later. Benjamin's apparent change of personality after the war has puzzled historians. The utter secrecy and privacy of his later life is anomalous given his earlier hunger for fame. No one can ever know, but certainly one key to understanding his silence after the war is his creation of a Confederate spy ring in Canada and the subsequent proclamation conceived by the Union's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and issued by Lincoln's successor, President Andrew Johnson, for the arrest of Davis and 7 Canadian Confederate spies after the Lincoln assassination. History, by means of the trials of the conspirators and by exhaustive investigations, has absolved both Benjamin and Davis from any responsibility. But the psychological and emotional impact on Benjamin of the long period of hysteria that followed the assassination must have taken its toll, especially since Lincoln's death fell on Good Friday and 2,500 sermons were given on Easter Sunday comparing Lincoln to a falling Christ figure as the nation acted out a passion play. There is no record of what Benjamin thought of the various published accusations against him. If Benjamin's role in history has been misjudged by historians and was minimized even by participants, much of the responsibility for that lies with Benjamin himself. He chose obscurity early in the war with the unwavering decision that he could best serve the South by serving Davis and remaining in the presidential shadow. For reasons that have puzzled historians, Benjamin buried his personal papers, some as he escaped from Richmond in 1865, and almost all of the rest just before he died, and he left only 6 scraps of paper at his death. One historian has called him a virtual incendiary. Benjamin fled to England after the war and built a second career as a successful international lawyer. He was called to the bar June 1866 after only 5 months' residence and achieved enormous financial success in his new home country. In 1868, he wrote a classic thesis on commercial law in England, treatise on the law of sale of personal property, known even today to law students as Benjamin on Sales. In 1872, he became a Queen's Counsel, participating with wig and robes in the House of Lords and appearing in 136 major cases. Although he had been known in the U.S. Senate as an outstanding orator, in England he gave no published speeches on the war. He left no articles, essays, or books about his role in the war or any other aspect of it. Indeed, he made only 2 public statements in 19 years that concerned the war. The first was a 3-paragraph letter to the Times of London in September 1865, just after he arrived in England, protesting the imprisonment of Jefferson Davis. The second was a short letter in 1883 contradicting the charge that millions of dollars in Confederate funds were left in European banks under his control. There were no letters defending strategy or admitting error, nor does history record any war-related conversations with students or scholars. He spent a few evenings at dinner with Davis when the ex-president visited London 5 times between 1868 and 1883. Otherwise, he avoided nostalgic encounters with friends from the South. It is one of the enduring mysteries that Benjamin chose to erase all ties to his previous life. In fact, he never even returned to the United States. Late in life, he retired and moved to Paris to be with his family. Benjamin died on May 6, 1884, and was buried in a cemetery in Paris under the name of Philippe Benjamin. 3 grandchildren died in childhood, and no direct descendants survived. In 1938, The parish chapter of the Daughters of the Confederacy finally provided an inscription to identify the man in the almost anonymous grave. The inscription reads, Judah P. Benjamin, born St. Thomas, West Indies, August 6, 1811, died in Paris, May 6, 1884, United States Senator from Louisiana, Attorney General, Secretary of War, and Secretary of State of the Confederate States of America, Queen's Counsel, London. In life, as in death, he was elusive, vanishing behind his agreeableness, his cordiality, his perpetual smile. To blend into the culture, whether Southern or English, was bred into him, a matter of the Jewish Southerner's instinct for survival. The public man, celebrated on 2 continents, sought a kind of invisibility not unlike the private man nobody knew. Shunning his past, choosing an almost secret grave with calculated concealment, he nearly succeeded in remaining hidden from history. Since his death, Benjamin's life has remained relatively unchallenged in the images that have come down through history. Although historians have routinely called him the brains of the Confederacy, they know relatively little about him. Many historians of the Civil War have referred to him as President Davis's most loyal confidant, but Davis himself, in his 1881 memoir of the Confederacy, referred to Benjamin in the most perfunctory fashion, mentioning his name only twice in the 1,500-page 2-volume work. That is especially odd, as President Davis's wife testified in a letter written in 1889, Benjamin spent almost every day in the office with her husband and was a central figure in events.